I'm Kim Moy, and I think I know every single one of you. My husband has had something called myalgic encephalomyelitis for about 30 years, so even before we met. It's a severely debilitating chronic illness with no cure. Different people will have different severity levels, but in his case, it got worse progressively worse about 10 years ago, where he basically could not work anymore about 10 years ago. Um, it's a kind of illness where there is severe cognitive brain fog, severe pain, severe fatigue, and quite frankly, quite a range of symptoms. So it's very, very debilitating. He spends most of his day in bed. I also help my sister with caregiving for our elderly parents, including my mother's with Alzheimer's. And there was a time where I was caregiving for both my husband and helping with my elderly parents, and had two small children, and I was a manager at work. It was really stressful. We talk about sandwich generation. I was in a pressure cooker situation. My parents have since passed, and that was actually allowed me to move to the Seattle area, which I did about 3 years ago. For the past 6 years, I've also been a leader of a support group, a monthly support group, and that has been something that's been a huge joy in my life to kind of have community, to bring community together and to be there for each other. And I tap upon different caregiving topics to really help others. And I left my corporate career about 2 years ago because I love that work with my volunteer work to lead the support group. I loved it so much, I wanted to do more and more of it. And so when I was laid off, I decided to pivot and have a career change, and decided to go full into caregiving coaching. And I became a board certified health and wellness coach last year. So if you're a caregiver, you're not alone. Over 65 million people in the US are caregivers. And I really love this quote by Rosalind Carter, but I'm not going to read it loud because I don't want to run out of time. But just know that caregiving touches so many people, and so many people have experienced this role. And yet it's so difficult. And no one teaches you. They don't teach this stuff in school, right? When I was a caregiver, especially when I was in this pressure cooker situation, I was seeking out books. I was looking for classes. I was working with therapists. I was working with I was looking to listening to, I was doing all these things to try to figure out how am I going to survive this thing? Okay. It took me a lot because there was no one stop guide, right? And it was really hard. And so what I realized is I like to do, since I've been a caregiver for now almost 20 years, I'm trying to figure out how do I shrink down a lot of the lessons I learned, sometimes through the hard way. How do I shrink it down to share with others? And that's what I try to do here today. So let's see. The first thing is to invest in your own self-care. Now, you probably have heard this before. And I used to hear it when I was, and I ignored it. I ignored it because there was way too much things to do. I'm like, I got a laundry list that is never ending. I keep on getting piles of new stuff on my list of things to do. I can't keep up. How am I going to squeeze in that self-care that people are talking about? I don't have time for that. Well, I paid the price. I paid the price. Because when I realized I wasn't taking care of myself, I was really grumpy. I was yelling at my kids, my husband. I was not fun to be around. At one point, I'm embarrassed to say, I actually yelled at my staff at work because I was so burnt. I was so fried. You don't want to get there, okay? So self-care doesn't mean going to the spa. That's what a lot of people think. There's so many different ways where you can have micro acts of self-care that you sprinkle in throughout the day. And you just start small, right? So in my support group, I've shared grounding breathing techniques to help calm down your body and your mind. It just takes a few minutes. You just need to learn it, and then you just need to do it. We breathe already. right? So learning how to breathe, actually, I've learned through my Zen teachers. And my main Zen teacher is Diane Wong, former executive director of AHAA. So I really found that a lot of those Zen kind of, I wouldn't say they're Zen techniques. They are techniques that I've learned through my Zen meditation practice that have helped me throughout my life. And so, and if you don't want to do that, just do something for 10 minutes in the morning. It can be meditation, it could be yoga stretches, it can be being outdoors, it could be sitting there with a cup of tea and just being. Do something restorative for yourself in the morning. Because the more replenished you are, the more resilient and joyful you can become. And over the years, what I've done is I've started out small and then I keep on adding and I keep on adding and I keep on adding. And that's how you really fill your cup. And then I'm just going to pause after each slide here to see if anyone has any questions or um, anything you want to add. Oh, okay, I'll keep on going on. The other is to join a support group. So the reason I say this is because support groups provide the community connection and helpful information for people in similar situations. So I mentioned that I'm leading a support group and it's specifically focused on partner caregivers and of people with my husband's kind of spectrum of illnesses. So in addition to myalgic encephalitis, there's also long COVID. So unfortunately or fortunately, we have a lot of people in my support group now. Um, you know, but by the way, anyone is welcome. If any of you want to just join, just pop in, that's fine. But we do focus on this particular audience because that way we can share tips with each other that are really relevant. And it's really important to uphold your mental health because what happens if you haven't already experienced this as a caregiver is that you can become really isolated and lonely because you're so busy doing all the things that you don't talk to other people. You don't talk to your friends. If you're working, you don't have time to go out after work to go have drinks or have dinner with people and socialize. You're back home doing all the things. So, attending a support group where people totally get what you're going through at home is really, really helpful. And then if you can't find a support group that you can meet in person or on Zoom, there are plenty of places where it's just all online. So it can be done asynchronously. There's Facebook groups, there's Reddit groups, there's other online communities. So if you need help looking for some, you could just Google it, right? The third is really important. And actually, I really am so thankful for my Zen teachers and teaching this to me. And this is something I share with the caregivers that I work with. And that is to adopt a non-attachment mindset. So, what does this mean? Well, there's this idea that life is constantly changing. So, if we accept that everything is constantly changing, like the clouds in the sky, right here in Seattle. Oh boy, our sky's been changing quite a lot the past few days, right? Right now, I see blue sky with a few patches of clouds floating through. Early this morning, it was raining. Yesterday, we had a tornado watch, and some people may have had hail, but we had thunder and lightning, where I live. I think early in the day, it was sunny yesterday. So it's constantly changing. Um, Life is constantly changing. So if you can accept that, you should try to not be so attached to the things that you're used to. And what I mean by that is what happens is we cause our own suffering when we're attached to the things how they used to be, like when our loved one was healthy or younger, or maybe how you expect them to be. Or maybe you're attached to the idea of how things should be like, oh my God, I can't believe, so and so is this way. Now I have to do all this extra work, right? I'll just speak for myself, right? For the longest time, I saw myself as a single mom with a special needs husband. And it was, it's hard not to feel resentful that I had to do all of the home housework, all of the finances, all of the things as if I was a single mom, and then all the caregiving things on top of it. So, I was attached to the way I thought things should have been before my husband got really sick, you know. But if you can accept that life is changing and you can accept what is today, how the things are now, right? Then you're in a better place, right? Because what happens is, again, if you can't adapt to the new circumstances, you're stuck, then you're suffering. I'm not saying to ignore your feelings. The idea is to feel your grief or whatever emotion you might have. It could be anger, it can be grief, it could be a whole assortment of things. Guilt, we talked about, right? Frustration. You could feel it, but don't get stuck in it. That's the key part. You want to let it go and not stay stuck. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay. The fourth lesson is to really pay attention to your physical health. We were just talking about this earlier before we started this recording. About 23%, I forgot to link to the source here in my deck, but about 23% of caregivers say their physical health has actually deteriorated due to caregiving. And you may recall just last month, Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman's wife, Betsy Arakawa, postponed her own medical care because she was worried about her husband with Alzheimer's. And this decision proved to be fatal to them both. That was such a sad story, so tragic. And it just really hit hard when I learned about that story. I just kept on reading about it and thinking, oh my gosh, you know, so easy to see myself in her shoes. I could totally see myself doing that. So it's really important to maintain these healthy habits like regular exercise, nutritious eating, and getting adequate sleep. Go to your own medical appointments. I'm getting really good about that. I used to just totally postpone them and just, I don't have time for that. I have to because people depend on me. People depend on you. If you fall apart, your family members are going to suffer. They may suffer more than if you just keep on operating, right? And ignoring your health. The fifth lesson is to develop an uplifting spiritual practice. And as I mentioned, I'm now a Zen student, and so that is my path. Everyone has their own path. It doesn't have to, and by the way, I would also mention that Zen, in my perspective, and I know in Diane's perspective, is Zen is not necessarily a religion, but it is kind of a way of thinking, a way of being, a way of doing in the world. Um, I was on a webinar this morning and they were talking about a rabbi who's also a Zen priest at the same time. So I just wanted to mention that. Um, but what's most important here is really to find activities that connect you to something bigger than yourself. That's what we mean by spiritual practice. So, I highly recommend meditation when I work with caregivers and doing coaching programs with them. And once they started, they're like, oh my God, this is so transformative. This has changed my life. I can now breathe. And I can, it just puts them in a different frame of mind. But if you don't want to do meditation, there are many other things you can do. I really believe in the healing power of nature. It's one of the reasons I moved to Seattle, in fact, to be closer to nature. There's so much of it out here. Walking outdoors. There's this concept of forest bathing, right? There's gardening. This picture you see here is a deer in my front garden. Actually, he's enjoying my garden as much as I am. Um, there's art appreciation. So we have John as a filmmaker, and I love to hear more about your films if we have time later on. There is art appreciation where you could go to a museum or you could just look at things, right? The paintings, there's poetry, music, so many different art forms because it takes you to something bigger than yourself. And then what I really love and starting to do in my own life is the creative self-expression. So there's arts and crafts, there's cooking. I do karo, which is the art of flower arranging from a Zen perspective. And that gives me great calm and joy. There are things that perhaps that you can do. For six, Sandy's going to recognize this. This is a good jobs journal. So our life coach had talked about this, and I really took it on, and I take it pretty seriously. The idea is before bed, list 3 to 5 things that you're proud of doing that day. Now, for caregivers, this is really transformative because it makes the invisible work of caregiving more visible for yourself. Because let's just say that I don't hear from my husband, oh, thank you for making that phone call to the doctor's office. I don't hear him saying, oh, thank you for, doing whatever, because a lot of it's invisible work. He doesn't even know I'm doing this stuff. And it takes up a lot of time and energy. So as a caregiver, if no one's saying good job to you, you can tell yourself good job by writing in a good job journal. Um, I particularly like this because I tend to focus on all the infinite number of things that I need to do on my to-do list. But instead, here at the end of the day, I can shine a light on all the things that I already did do and can feel really good about. It's a good way to end the day, to kind of end in a positive note and go to sleep well, thinking positive things, right? So this is very simple. And the caregivers that I work with really like this one. Whoops, number six. Oh, number seven, embracing ambiguous loss and radical acceptance. How many of you have heard of ambiguous loss? Raise hands. Nope. Okay. This is a really powerful concept that really hit hard for me. And every caregiver that I talk to, when I talk about this, like, oh, that's what I've been feeling. And when you name something, there's a power to it. So, ambiguous loss in the context of caregiving is when there's a psychological absence with a physical presence, meaning a loved one is physically present, but psychologically they're either absent or they have changed. So, in a debilitating chronic illness, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, any other kind of dementia, stroke, traumatic brain injury, anything really, any kind of illness, um, they are not the same person they used to be. And there's grief involved with that. So acknowledging it, right? The issue here is you want to be frozen in the grief, okay? So the journey, this is a very condensed, I teach a whole course on this whole thing, but I condensed it all and I also have a blog post on this if you want to read a little bit more about this. Um, the journey towards healing involves two things: to grieve the life that the illness has taken away, and two, to enjoy the life that still continues. So much like John was talking about, right? You adapt, right? Kind of like a shark. They say the shark has to keep on swimming. It adapts, right? Don't stop, right? But I want to go back to this because grieving is important. And, something, happened recently in my life where I had to stop and grieve it. And because I had to acknowledge that there's grief involved. And then you could say, okay, I kind of processed it and now I can move on, right? And so part of this is navigating ambiguous loss requires, quite frankly, a multifaceted approach. One of the things that I feel is key to this is this concept of radical acceptance. So again, the idea here is to accept a new reality in your relationship with your loved one. So you can ask yourself these 3 questions, right? And you may want to journal on this later on. One, what can you do to accept your loved one as they are right now? 2, how can you resist the urge to compare past versions of them to who they are today? And 3, what moments still make us laugh and smile together? Because love, laughter, smiling, that's all medicine for you. That's powerful medicine. The 8th lesson here is to learn how to navigate changing relationships. And Laura, you talked a little bit about your husband, right? And so, yeah, I'm a spousal caregiver too. So, one thing to acknowledge is as humans, we're all constantly changing. You're changing, your loved one is changing, right? So then it's really important to learn effective interpersonal communication skills, which they don't really teach in school. And I feel like, I've taken classes on this. I had a therapist who's a member of my support group who actually gave a kind of like a workshop on it. I'm like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. And so I teach that as part of my curriculum. And so it's really important to think about interpersonal communication skills. There are some really basic fundamental things that they don't teach in school. And remember that conflict is part of every relationship and to pick your battles. Um, and the other part that I still struggle with, quite frankly, is to not let caregiving overshadow your relationship with your loved one. It's so easy for that to happen when there's a lot of caregiving involved, when your loved one requires a lot of caregiving. Um, and it's important to remember that person still, you still have another primary relationship with them, right? So you need to nourish that relationship too. And it's easy to forget. And I know I have. And you're only human. If it's happened, don't feel guilty. Just figure out, okay, how can I flip this a little bit? Just a little bit. You also need to realize that your relationships with others may change due to these changing life circumstances you have, whether it's other family members, what we just talked about, right? Other siblings, maybe your friends, right? Because your priorities have changed. You can't go hang out anymore, right? Maybe you don't have time. Maybe, you're so, you know, I know I haven't had much time to do things that I used to be able to do. So just know that and know that you just need to adapt, like John was saying. You need to learn how to navigate changing relationships, changing situations. Number 9 is to set boundaries. Now, what are boundaries, right? So you see here, here's a fence, right, on this slide. So boundaries are limits and guidelines that we set to protect our physical, emotional, and mental well-being. So they're actually really important, right? It's important to identify your own needs. And I think we were just talking about that earlier. And then once I think I'll just speak for myself. Sometimes it's hard to identify my own needs because we tend to be selfless as caregivers, like, oh, I'm just gonna, well, at least I'll speak for myself. Oh, this needs to be done. Okay, I'll go do it. Right. And then your needs are on the back burner. And you don't even know what your needs are after a certain period of time. That can happen. And that leads to burnout. So it is important to identify your needs first. And then you can set your boundaries compassionately yet firmly with everyone around you, including your loved one, right? Um, and the thing is, you may need to practice it, right? About being calm, clear, and firm, and perhaps even establishing consequences when others cross your boundaries. And the last part of this that I have issues with still is sometimes you need to set boundaries with yourself about what you're going to do and or what you won't do as a caregiver. It's a slippery slope sometimes, right? Um, so there's more I could say about that, but I'll pause and go on to the next slide because I'm looking at the clock here. Number 10 is really important too, and that's to have compassion for your loved one and self-compassion for yourself. This is something I'm still working on. We're all doing our best. Usually, we're all doing our best. Give people grace. You have to understand sometimes your loved one may be grumpy. I know mine certainly is a lot of the time. Well, maybe it's because he's in a freaking level of pain, right? Oh, yeah, I kind of forgot that. Oh, he has a migraine. Oh, yeah, I kind of forgot that, right? They're unwell, perhaps physically and emotionally. So give them some grace. That said, you don't want to be a punching bag either, right? So, that again, set your boundaries there. But you need to also give yourself grace and to speak kindly to yourself as you would to a friend. I had to tell myself recently, I'm doing the best I can in this current circumstance. And that's got to be good enough today. And cut yourself some slack. Give yourself some grace. Speak to yourself like you would to a friend. It's easy for us to have these critical voices in our head. And you got to kind of override that, right? What would a friend say to you? And be that friend to yourself.